the last time I'm going to talk about this, so I wanted to make it good. Now, during the live stream, I set out a lot of magnets on the board. How do these magnets strike you? I tried to get all the Canadian teams on here, and it just didn't work. So I was going to have all the ones that missed the playoffs and all the ones that made it. So here we go. That's the last time I'm going to talk to Canada about this. There's no collusion. No, that's not the word. There's no... there's all kidding aside. There's no conspiracy against Canada, and I will talk about why. First, let's take a look at the Canadian teams through the years, and which ones made the playoffs and what round they got to. And if I missed one or two because I had to move these magnets around a few times, I apologize. But the basic idea here is the same. 1994, and I'm only going based on Gary Bettman years because that's what everybody thinks has been going on. Is that Bettman? All right, whatever. 1994, Toronto gets to round 3. They got knocked out by Vancouver, who went to the finals. Calgary was knocked out in the first round by Vancouver. If there's a conspiracy, it was Vancouver to get rid of Canadian teams that year. And Montreal was out in round 1 in 1994. So the Canucks get to Game 7 of the Stanley Cup final, and they lost the game fair and square to the New York Rangers, as much as it's a dagger in my heart to say it. 1995, Colorado was about to be moved to Colorado. This is actually the Nordiques. I'm just using this as an example because I don't have a Nordiques magnet this small. So the Nordiques were out in round 1. Toronto was out in round 1. Calgary was out in round 1. And Vancouver was out in round 2. Good night, everybody. So Canada didn't last that year. 1996. Coyotes, meaning the old Jets. I have the new Jets on the board, so the old Jets, yeah. Arizona's out in round 1. Calgary's out in round 1. Montreal's out in round 1. Toronto's out in round 1. Vancouver's out in round... That's right, round 1. So we're into year 3 of the conspiracy. 1997. Montreal's out in round 1. Edmonton's out in round 2. I believe that was the year they knocked out Dallas. And Ottawa's out in round 1. There you go. 1998. Edmonton's out in round 2. Ottawa's out in round 2, and Montreal's out in round number 2. See, there's no these teams were huge contenders issue here. Not with Canadian teams. 1999. Edmonton's out in round 1. Ottawa's out in round 2. Toronto's out in the 3rd round. They made the conference final that year. 2000. Edmonton's out in round 1. Ottawa's out in round 1. Toronto's out in round 2. Toronto knocked out Ottawa that year. Conspiracy. Very often, it's weird, but there's a lot of times, and I just didn't have room on the board, where Canadian teams are against each other. So you might have 4 Canadian teams in the playoffs, but in reality, you can only have 2 or 3 in the next round. 2001. Ottawa's out in round 1. Edmonton's out in round 1. Toronto's out in round 2. How did they get to round 2? By beating Ottawa again, of course. And Vancouver's out in round 1. 2002. Ottawa's out in round 2. Vancouver's out in round 1. Toronto gets to round 3 that year. And Montreal's out in round 2. Now, was Toronto hosed out of a cup in 2002? No. Could people have argued that back in 93... they were hosed out of a chance to play Montreal in the final? Maybe. That I could almost understand. But that's not part of this narrative, so we can't get into that. 2003, Vancouver's out in round 2. Edmonton, round 1. Ottawa, round 3. And Toronto, round 1. 2004, Calgary, finals, and this is everybody's favorite. Calgary should have won that series. No. And I'm totally fine with saying, nope. That was won by the Tampa Bay Lightning. Tampa won that series. And I know Flames fans aren't going to like it, but I don't see a big conspiracy there. I just don't. Toronto's out in round 2. Vancouver's out in round 1. Montreal's out in round 2. And Ottawa's out in round 1. And I'll get to the conspiracy theory about champions when I'm done summarizing how Canadian teams did in the playoffs. 2006. Ottawa's out in round 2. Calgary's out in round 1. Montreal's out in round 1. And the Oilers reached the finals. No conspiracy here. Dwayne Rolison got hurt. Now, unless he got Tanya Hardinged by Gary Bettman as he went onto the ice, you can't claim that somehow the NHL made Edmonton lose in that final. It was as soon as Rolison was hurt, and they went with Markkanen, and I like Markkanen, but he was not good enough in the finals, and they got beat by Cam Ward and the Hurricanes. 2007, Calgary goes out in round one. Ottawa reached the finals and were overwhelmed by a Ducks team that was much better than they were. Round two for Vancouver that year, when they got knocked out by Anaheim, and they only got to round two because Roberto Luongo willed it to be. 2008, Calgary's out in round one, Montreal's out in round two, and Ottawa's out in round one. I don't know why I said Edmonton. Edmonton isn't going to be mentioned again for a while. None of these teams are contenders. The ones that get to the finals, Calgary, that was an underdog story. That was an underdog story for Edmonton. Wasn't an underdog story for Ottawa. It was finally they break through after all these years of frustration, but still, they got beat by the better team in the finals. 2009, Calgary's out in round one. Montreal's out in round one. For Vancouver, it's round two. I'll go ahead and tilt this down just a little bit. There we go. 2010, Montreal made it to round three because Jarro Halak stole the first two rounds. Was fantastic. Third round, that was it. They got to that round, and then it wouldn't have mattered anyways because Chicago was waiting in the final for whoever came out of the East. And they were out in round three, Ottawa round one, and Vancouver round two. And that's when Chicago started being a nemesis for them. Actually, the nemesis started here. 2011, Montreal's out in round one. Vancouver reaches the finals and gets destroyed by Boston in Game 7. Absolutely annihilated. 2012, and where Vancouver really lost it was Game 6. If they'd wanted to win that Stanley Cup and make it work, they had to win Game 6, and they lost it. 2012, Ottawa, out in round one. Vancouver, out in round one. 2013, Toronto, round one. Ottawa, round two. Montreal, round one. Vancouver, round one. There's a theme there. 2014, the only Canadian team in there, unless magnets dropped off this board like crazy, was Montreal, and they went to the third round. 2015, Ottawa, round one. Winnipeg got swept, round one. Calgary got out of round one and then met Anaheim in the second round, and it didn't last much longer for them, round two. Montreal, round two, and Vancouver, round one. That's right, that's the 1 year Willie Desjardins got them in the playoffs. He's quite proud of that. 2016, no Canadian teams made the playoffs. None. 2017, so we're into last season now. Ottawa reaches round three, 1 game away, so close. But in the end, they couldn't knock off the Penguins, and who could? Calgary round one, Edmonton round two. Both Calgary and Edmonton lost to the Ducks, so maybe the Ducks are a part of this somehow. We'll get to that. Montreal round one, Toronto round one. This year's playoffs, Toronto made it, lost in the first round. And we don't know how far Winnipeg's going to go at the time I'm recording this. At the time I'm recording this, the Winnipeg Jets are still in the playoffs in the third round. Could end all of this frustration. But it's not just Canadian teams that get frustrated. Arizona, Buffalo, Columbus, Florida, Minnesota, Nashville, New York Islanders, Philadelphia, St. Louis, San Jose, Washington. None of them have won a Stanley Cup since Gary Bettman took over. Not one of them. And it's weird. Because if we look at teams that we say, Bettman's in love with this team and wants them to do well, you've got Arizona, that he won't let get moved. Florida, he doesn't let them get moved. Nashville, he didn't let them get moved either. And to some extent, Buffalo, when they were struggling, that team could have been moved too. What the hell? And then if you're looking at his expansion teams as his babies, you got to add Columbus and Minnesota. Bettman's doing a terrible job fixing things. Horrible. The Islanders, they're not drawing. They're a team that's really hurting and keeps drawing money every year. You need to get them a Stanley Cup. Washington, Bettman goes to Capitals games. Every time I turn around, he's at a Capitals game. He's got to be cheering for the Capitals on some level. And then what do you got left? You got San Jose. Well, they're an expansion team from before he came in, so I'm not going to say they're one of his favorites. Then there's St. Louis and Philly. Yeah, you guys are just screwed. Bettman hates you guys. I guess. And Here's part of my argument before you get into Stanley Cup winners. Which of these teams, which of these organizations had significant excellence over a period of, say, 3 to 5 years where you can say, oh, yeah, that team should have won a Stanley Cup? Vancouver's the one that I always look at because I always hear fans say, oh, well, when Luongo was in Vancouver, they were an awesome team. Round 2, missed the playoffs. Round 2, finals. Round 1, and he's gone. You guys let me know where that amazingly excellent team is, because that finals, he was getting crucified after that finals. Let's get on to Stanley Cup winners. Rangers. The fix is in, man. The Rangers hadn't won a Stanley Cup since 1940. The NHL really desperately wanted the New York Rangers to win a Stanley Cup. That's why the Rangers won it. They haven't won one since, so they've still only won one Stanley Cup in 78 years. But man, that one Stanley Cup. New Jersey, 1995. They won it in 2000. They won it in 2003. That's 3 Stanley Cups. Denying all these teams. A jerk move. Colorado wins in 96, wins in 2001. Detroit, 97, 98, 2002, 2008. Is anybody going to say that those teams didn't deserve 4 Stanley Cups? Because I hated the Detroit Red Wings at the time. And they deserved each Stanley Cup they got. Dallas won their one Stanley Cup in 1999, which means that in over 50 years as a franchise, they have 1 championship. That's not a tremendous winning, we're awesome, hooray for everything kind of thing. Tampa won it in 2004, and again I heard, well, it's a Southern team, and Bettman wants the Southern teams to win. Yeah, no. Because Tampa, this is their chance to get back to the final, which would be their second time back to the final since they lost in 2004. But this was not a team that the NHL in any way propped up. The team gave away tickets at one point, but it wasn't propped up by the NHL. 2006, oh yeah. This is the NHL is going to keep giving it to teams in the South because, Carolina, they can't draw, and now the NHL is going to hand them a Stanley Cup because, that's what the NHL does. That's why they've missed the playoffs 9 years in a row. Because the NHL's just stealthily getting them to their next Stanley Cup. They wait about 13 years in between, so next year they'll get that Stanley Cup. So they just let ownership know, hey, we're going to let you have another Stanley Cup, but we have to wait 13 years first so we don't look really crooked. 2007, Anaheim gets their only Stanley Cup. And that's part of the problem I have. If we're going to argue that the league favors certain teams over others, why are teams only getting 1 Stanley Cup? Why are all these teams getting none? Shouldn't there be dynasties? Technically, there hasn't been a dynasty since the late 80s, early 90s. 1990, when Edmonton won their 5th time in 7 years, that was the end of their dynasty. There hasn't been one since that qualifies. A dynasty is qualified as a team that wins 3 Stanley Cups in 4 years. And you could argue that in this period here between 96 and 2008, that Colorado, Detroit, and the Devils were, well, I guess from 95 until 2008, the Devils, the Avalanche, and Detroit, they were the 3 dynasties of the league that they shared the trophy. Because nobody else, only Detroit, or only Dallas in here, gets that Stanley Cup in that period of time. So was the fix in for one of them? Because Colorado's crashed since then, and New Jersey had a good year this year, but they crashed before that, and Detroit right now is in the crapper. So the league isn't doing a very good job taking care of them unless they're rotating it. See, because in 2009, Pittsburgh wins the Stanley Cup. After Detroit got another one in 2008, so I've mentioned Detroit here. Pittsburgh wins again in 2016, 2017, but if the NHL favors Pittsburgh, what happens here? Because in between 2010 and 2015, you've got 3 Stanley Cups for the Chicago Blackhawks. Well, clearly they favor the Hawks, except they kept screwing them with the salary cap. And was it the NHL that decided that the Dale Talon issue that caused him to be let go in Chicago, which was the restricted free agent qualifying offers not being officially submitted to the league in time, and Dale Talon took the fall for somebody else. Whatever happened, it's weird because Chicago had 3 Stanley Cups despite the salary cap. LA wins 2 Stanley Cups here. Boston gets theirs in 2011. So from 2010 till 2015, that's 6 years, 3 teams had the Stanley Cup. This isn't about these teams here. This is about the fact that we haven't had dynasties per se, but we have had periods of time where, unless you're certain organizations, you don't get to touch the cup. These ones, this was a one-off for these 3 teams right here. For Tampa, Carolina, and Anaheim. And enough time has passed since Tampa won a Stanley Cup that if they win it this year, yeah, 2004 was a one-off. There's nobody lingering around from that team. So unless you're New Jersey, Colorado, or Detroit, with the exception of Dallas in here, which is a one-off, that's a pretty continuous line of excellence among those teams. You have a low Canadian dollar during some of those years. You have Detroit able to buy a Stanley Cup right up until here, okay? And anything after here is in the salary cap era. So we always hear about, well, in the salary cap era, it's harder to build a winner. Okay, but in the years before the salary cap came in, we were seeing quite a turnover in Stanley Cup champions as well. And then, of course, the last 2 years we had Pittsburgh. This year, who do we have left? We have Washington, who knocked these guys out, who I've been reading all year that there's a league plan to make them 3-time winners and to build up a dynasty. That's what the NHL wanted. You have Tampa, who I guess is a league favorite. It doesn't make any sense. Vegas fixes in Vegas first year. The problem with that is if the NHL favors expansion teams, why didn't Minnesota or Columbus or San Jose or Tampa got their Stanley Cup about 12 years later? Ottawa's still waiting on theirs. Winnipeg is the old Atlanta Thrashers, so they're still waiting. Like there are a lot, and Nashville is still sitting here too. There's not a lot of satisfaction with expansion teams. So why all of a sudden would Vegas? It doesn't make sense, especially if the argument of them not being a hockey market makes any sense. Like it just doesn't. It doesn't work. And then this is why my brain fries. This is why when I talk about this stuff and people say you're just a shill, you haven't been paying attention. I've been paying attention. I've been watching hockey since 1982. And the reason why Canadian teams have these results in the playoffs and they can't quite get over the hump, they're not good enough. Vancouver in 1994 loses to the New York Rangers. Mark Messier, Brian Leetch, Mike Richter. Huge superstar lineup of teams that these guys had played with, for, and just the old Oilers on the... Anyways, and that's insane. Then in 2004, Calgary gets there against Tampa, but Tampa was the better team. 2006, the Oilers, that was an underdog team. Barely made the playoffs, underdog team gets there. 2007, as I said, they are handled by the Anaheim Ducks. 2011, anybody arguing Vancouver should have won that Stanley Cup final? Didn't watch it. Didn't watch it. So yeah, we may very well see Winnipeg go to a Stanley Cup final this year, and will there be a fix? And if Winnipeg wins the Stanley Cup, it's not going to make that talk go away. People are going to say, oh yeah, well, Winnipeg won. But what about all those other years? They weren't good enough. We had 3 Stanley Cup finalists in a row right here from Canada. This is when my theory was that the pressure on teams to win a Stanley Cup for teams from Canada was really, really strong. And that in these big games, it favors teams in a location where they don't have the same pressure. Tampa, Carolina, Anaheim. Yeah, they have their fan bases, but Carolina, it's smaller. There's not as much pressure on that home team. For Vancouver, they were against Boston. There was pressure in Boston, but not like Vancouver. Holy crap. The pressure on the Canucks that year was intense. So there you go. This is the last time I'm going to mention this topic, and because I find it insane. I really do. And there are enough one-offs in here, teams that win that one Stanley Cup and then don't come back to win another one, that kind of show that there's no the league just, the amount of work that goes into fixing all this is just too much. Canadian teams have not been good enough. And whether you're looking at in the 90s, the mid to late 90s, when the Canadian dollar was awful, you're looking at up until the salary cap came in, Toronto was able to pay people whatever they wanted. Toronto was paying all kinds. But a lot of the other teams, whether it was Edmonton or Ottawa or Calgary, not necessarily Vancouver, but a lot of these teams were have-nots. And in the salary cap era, sure, teams are spending money. Are they spending it smartly? Did the Edmonton Oilers spend their money smartly when they brought in Milan Lucic? No. We can argue that getting rid of Hall and getting rid of Eberle and bringing in what they did, and that moves like this, that's what's hosed them. That's why this year's playoffs only had 2 Canadian teams in it out of 7. 7. So, there you go. And one of the Canadian teams that made it this year is one of the ones that missed, and that's the team that's off to the conference finals, which will start on Saturday. My final word, I understand there's going to be downvotes, there's going to be people that disagree with me, but really, honestly, I just see a pattern here of Canadian mediocrity with franchises, and finally with Winnipeg, there's a real chance to do something special. I'm not saying I didn't get excited with some of these finals. I cheered for Tampa here. I cheered for Carolina here. I cheered for Ottawa in that one, though, and I cheered for Vancouver in that one and in that one. So in all of these times Canada goes to the Stanley Cup finals, I've cheered for the Canadian teams 3 out of 5 times. Sue me. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. Hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. I've been requested to do something where I talk about the entry draft for newer fans to the game, and I have no problem doing that. But that's it for this for now. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon.